Welcome to this episode of End of Life Conversations. I'm Reverend Wakil David Matthews.
And I'm the Reverend Mother Ana Luisa Armendariz. In this podcast, we share people's experiences with death and dying, grief and loss, and the end of life.
Every episode, we are so honored and blessed to share stories with amazing, compassionate, and wise guests. So let's get started.
Welcome to this new episode where we welcome Jill McClennen. Jill is a certified death doula, a non-medical professional specially trained to provide holistic care for individuals in their final stages of life. She offers comprehensive support, preparation, and deep soul healing to her clients and their families, whether in person or through virtual sessions, as she works as a death doula and end-of-life coach.
In her virtual practice, Jill helps people prepare themselves and their loved ones for the end of life, offering guidance and emotional support, regardless of physical distance. Jill is also the host of the Seeing Death Clearly podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. Through her podcast, she talks with guests and they share valuable insights and stories related to end-of-life matters, further extending her mission to promote understanding and compassion about this important stage of life. And of course, that's what we're all about here as well. So it seemed like a perfect fit to have Jill join us today. So welcome, Jill.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation because, yes, being on another podcast that's about death as well does not come across to me very often. So I'm excited to talk with people that also talk about the same thing all the time.
Yay!
Beautiful. Well, we'd like to start with this first question. When did you first become aware of death?
So when I was a child, I basically lived with my grandmother and my grandfather. My mother worked all the time. She was a single mom. So, I grew up with grandmom and grandpop. And when I was 4, my grandfather died. So the last couple of years of his life, he actually, he had lung cancer and then it spread to his brain. And so he was, getting care in the house. He had the hospital bed right in the living room. And I remember a little bit about like him being there. I remember pushing his wheelchair through the living room, trying to get him around places. And then one day I came home from kindergarten with my grandmother. She'd come and pick me up. And I remember walking into the backyard and the neighbors were back there and Grandpa was laying on the ground. He had fallen. The neighbors came over to help pick him up. And then they took him to the hospital and he never came back. That was it. Never saw him again. Nobody even really explained to me what happened. It just was kind of like he was there and then he was gone. And so, I think especially as I got older, like I realized he had died, but I didn't realize until I was much older that not having the ability to talk about it with anybody or have anybody explain it to me or any of those things, I actually was like holding all of that still within me. So that's really my first memory of somebody dying, but I didn't really even remember the death. He just kind of disappeared.
Right. So this mystery.
It was a mystery for sure.
And so based on this story, what is your trajectory in your life and how does death impact that story?
I think after that, I don't remember it changing me too much as far as like, I know sometimes I talk to people that they'll say, then I was terrified afterwards. Every time somebody left, they weren't going to come home. I didn't have any of that. When I was a child, my grandmother and I used to go to a assisted living that was, pretty close by. It was a Catholic organization that ran it. And so we would go and we would bring rosary beads and sing and, do all this stuff, take people to church because there was like a little chapel there. And so I remember going into rooms that people were obviously closer to death. And my grandmother had told me even when I was in high school that a lot of the other kids that would come with us would be really afraid. Even some of the adults would be really afraid to go in the room. And here I was, 6, 7, whatever it was. And I would just like walk right into the room. I'd walk right up to people. And she had thought maybe it's because I was so comfortable around my grandfather because I was always there with him. And, they said even at one point he couldn't talk anymore. because of the brain tumor. So he would like try to talk, and I was the only person that could understand him. They would eventually ask me what Grandpop wanted. So she just assumed it was that. Now I'm not sure. I think there was part of me that was drawn into this type of work, working with people that were nearing death. I just didn't know it at the time. I didn't even think about doing this work until I was in my 30s. So,
And what is this current work?
yeah. So right now I am a death doula. And so backtrack a little bit. When I was in my 30s, I took care of my grandmother, same grandmother, at the end of her life. And I lived with her, and I, was so grateful to have that time with her. But I realized, especially when she went on to hospice, how unprepared I was, because you just don't get nobody talks to you about it. Nobody explains anything. The doctor just kind of sent her home and said she was going to be on hospice. And thank God for the hospice nurses who were amazing. I'm actually still friendly with one of them. I don't know, 13 years later, we still keep in touch with each other because they were so helpful in explaining to me what was happening, that this was normal, this was natural. But it still was a very overwhelming situation because I was not prepared. And at that point, though, I had thought, maybe I want to go back to school to be a hospice nurse. But then I also was like, I see some of what the nurses do, and I don't know if I want to do some of that work. Thank God they're doing it, but maybe isn't for me. Plus, I had a baby at the time. I owned a bakery. It was a whole different time in my life. So it took me about 10 years. And then I heard of a death doula, and I was at a good point in life when both of my children were a little bit older. I felt ready to, study at night after I was done working. I was like, it's fine. I could get on the computer. I could take my courses. I could do what I need to do. And I have been doing this work now for about 4 years. And like you mentioned at the beginning, it is non-medical. So it's really more the emotional support, the spiritual support, helping people and their families prepare. And of course, educate really just about the realities of death and dying and grief, because we don't talk about it enough in our culture. Right?
Right. Yeah, it's absolutely right.
Exactly.
And that's why I started a podcast, because I wanted to hear these conversations. And there was not that many out there that were really having the conversations that I wanted to be hearing and wanted to have. So I did it myself.
Yay.
Yeah, good. That's exactly what happened to us.
Yeah, it really is.
Same response. Like, why aren't we hearing this anywhere? Why are people so afraid to talk about this? So, yeah, thank you. Can you talk about what your biggest challenges are in this work or in life in general?
Some of the biggest challenges in life right now are also about the career change, because it's not easy to get paying clients right now in this work. And it also is that I really would love to do all of the work for free. Like, I don't enjoy going out and trying to sell my services to people. And it's not because I don't believe in them, but it's that really, I would love to give it to everybody for free, but that's not the way our economy works. Like, I'm not going to get food for my children for free because I'm doing my work for free. So I'm trying to find that balance. But most people still haven't heard of death doulas. It's getting out there more and more. But I don't have people coming across me because they searched the internet for death doula. It's happened once so far in 4 years where they said, oh, somebody told me I should get a death doula. And so I searched and I found you. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. You found me.
Wonderful.
It is really tricky too. And so I present as a death midwife, and I've trained in a lot of different areas, like, herbalism and Reiki. And so I have this like tool chest of things that I offer. And so I go by death midwife. I meet doulas and they're like, oh, we all like are the same. And I'm like, so when I had my babies, I had my birth midwife who came and checked my home and like made sure we had food and made sure the neighbors were all like, everything was set up by my midwife. But the doula came and would sit right next to me and would make sure that when things got really tough, she's like, oh, we've talked about this. This is the next step that we should do, because it's the advocate for the person who is in process. Right. And so I think when I explain to people, like, death doulaing is about being present to the person who is transitioning, different from a chaplain, a social worker, a nurse. And, the family could use a midwife, but the doula is just there to support the person, with fears or anxieties or spiritual questions. And, people are now paying more for birth doulas. So hopefully they will start paying for death doulas as well. So I hear you, because I'm in the same boat.
And I think they will start paying for the services. And again, I mean, I've had people that have been happy to pay me for it if they know to find
you.
me. And the whole difference with the midwife and the doula thing, I do find it interesting because it does feel like it's very overlapping, where there's people that say they're a doula, people that say they're a midwife. It just depends on what language they want to use. But when I was looking into this, I think the biggest thing that stopped me from using the term midwife versus doula was I had read an article that was saying a midwife is actually a medical professional. When birthing midwives, they're actually medical professionals. They can, prescribe medications. They can do all these things that birth doulas can't do.
Right.
And so they recommended that end of life doulas don't use that term unless they're a medical professional. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So not saying you should change your term.
Oh, yeah.
I hadn't heard anybody explain it the way that you did, but I had a midwife, but I didn't have a birth doula. So I never actually worked with a birth doula myself, partially because, again, I didn't really know any. Now I feel like I know probably 10 easily.
Yeah.
And when I had my first child, 13 years, almost 14 years ago, I didn't really know any where I was living locally. But now there are quite a few. So I'm hopeful that doulas will kind of do the same thing. Death doulas will kind of do the same thing, that over time, people will go, oh, I need one of these.
Right.
Because I've talked to other people that have used them.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what do you need to feel supported in your work?
I don't know for sure, because I think part of it is I'm still figuring the work out myself. Like you said, I like to work with people who are dying, but I actually do like to work with their family members as well. I have worked with people that have already experienced the death of a loved one, and I work with them around grief. And so I think sometimes the biggest thing that could, really help support me in my work is me just also getting clearer over time as to what my work is, what parts of the work I really want to do, what I'm good at. Because I also do Reiki as well. I do shamanic healing techniques with people. I even do trauma sensitive yoga and movement with people. So, I try to use other modalities as well to help kind of, everybody. But yeah, I think right now, I don't know. I mean, I've had business coaches, and I've had, of course, my death doula mentor. I volunteer at a hospital now where I work with a really amazing palliative care team, that the palliative care social worker and the doctors and, the chaplains, everybody's just been so amazing in, educating me and helping me learn. And then I can support them because there was areas I didn't even know. I didn't think to offer end of life doula support to nurses and doctors because I assumed nurses and doctors would be great with death, and they're not.
Yeah, that's true.
Very true.
I had, the palliative care doctor one day say to me, 2 separate times, one time, can you talk to this nurse? Her, the patient died. She's really having a hard time. She's in the hallway crying. We can't calm her down. And I was like, oh, yeah, of course I can. And then another time it was a doctor who they were trying to really talk to the doctor about just basically stopping treatments. And the doctor kept wanting to give more treatment. And the palliative care doctor was like, no, it's time we stop. And, they were like, can you talk to them? And I was like, I feel a little intimidated because what do I know? And they were like, about death and how it's okay. It's part of the process.
Right.
I had never thought about that before until there was a need for it.
Yeah. And Wakil, this is how you and I started talking about it, because we had done our practicums and you saw that need, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly. We started talking after I finished spending a year as a chaplain assistant, basically, for hospice, and really noticed that one of the biggest needs was the people in the hospice staff needing it. Even the administrators, everybody involved in hospice on a staff level was really needing that support and needing somebody to hold them and listen to them and be present for them. And of course, the whole hospice situation can be really stressful for people who are carrying compassionate people but have to manage the business model. That by itself creates a level of stress that it really needs people to be able to listen and pay attention to. So, yeah, I agree. That was part of why we started talking about this. So what frightens you most about the end of life, Jill?
Right now, the thing that frightens me the most is dying while my children are young. I don't want to leave them with no mother. The death itself, I'm not afraid of, and I actually never have been afraid of death itself. But once I had children, it just changed so much. I mean, people tell you that when you have children, it changes you, but you don't understand how much it's really going to change you. And so I think right now that's really my only fear is, potentially getting sick, having them have to watch me slowly die sounds just terrible. I don't want them to have to go through that. And I know I don't have control over it. I do the best I can. I take care of myself. I go to the doctor, get my checkups. I do what I can, but I can't prevent it completely. As I get older, I think if I was, maybe in my 80s or my 90s, I think actually at that point, being kept alive too long is what scares me. I've watched people just live longer than they really should have in a state that is not really living. And I don't want that. And I like to think that my children would make sure that doesn't happen to me or my husband or, whoever's around at that point. But I don't know for sure. And so that's probably my biggest fear. The death itself, I mean, it seems to me it's probably not painful, right? The actual death. The things that are killing us might be painful, but the death itself doesn't seem to be painful. And even though I don't know what comes after this, I'm not necessarily worried about what comes after this. Whether it's nothing, which is what my husband believes, we're just going to go out like a light bulb and then that's it. There's nothing. Whether it's, reincarnation. I mean, okay, sure. I don't really necessarily want to do this over again. But hopefully if I do, I will have a nice reincarnation, I think I would. Heaven and hell, I don't know if I believe that they're real either. But I mean, if they are, I think I would probably go to heaven. So I don't know. I'm not really worried about that part. It's really more the human experience of the suffering that can sometimes come before death that I worry about.
Right.
Sure.
And so how could you feel more supported concerning this fear?
Having the conversation with my family. I do try to be very age appropriately honest with my children about life, and death, and that ideally I'm not going to die anytime soon. But the reality that I could get into a car after this phone call and I could die in a car accident. It's going to happen to somebody today. Why not me? Right? I'm not special. There's nothing that could prevent it from me being that person. And so I like to really make sure that multiple times a day, I express my love and my appreciation to my family so that if today was that day, they'd never have any doubts that I loved them and that I cared about them. And, I don't ever want to leave the house or have them leave the house thinking that I'm mad at them and upset with them about something. So I try to make that effort to not have that happen. And then, of course, the idea of the prolonged life that is not necessarily living. I mean, my husband and I do have conversations. We've been having this conversation. Again, I think I've never really been afraid of death. So we started talking about this when we were in our 20s. where I was like, if anything happens to me, do not keep me alive. Like, please don't do that. And so we've always had this conversation. And I believe that he will do everything possible to make sure my wishes are followed. Yeah, I think just the more that we could have these conversations and the more that we can get everybody comfortable with death and dying and realizing that death is not the worst thing that could happen. Being kept alive for years, sometimes, even months, in a bed where I can't do anything that I enjoy doing. I maybe don't know who people are. I mean, I don't want that. That's not living to me. Just because my body's physically alive, that's not living. And I'm hoping that doctors will kind of start to understand some of that as well, because I understand that they get trained to keep people alive as long as possible.
Yeah.
But I don't think it serves the people all the time. And we need to find that balance.
So true. So true.
Yeah. And I do love that it's conversations. I feel like conversations are gold. Like all of us just keep talking about this so that there is a comfort level with children and family and friends so that it flows and not just like stopped by technology.
Yeah. And I think both Ada Luisa and I have conversations regularly with our family. That's part of our
practice or a spiritual practice, actually. You know?
Yeah. And we both also work with folks to create advanced care directives, which write all that stuff down and make sure people know about it. In a class that I give, I suggest that right after your birthday, you have a death day and you sit down with everybody and talk about what your plans are, what you really want to do, and has it changed since last year when you first talked about it. So I've had that conversation with my kids who are now grown. And I know Ana Luisa's children as well have kind of gotten comfortable with the
supremely
fact
comfortable.
that that's what we're going to talk about. How do you keep yourself resourced in the work that you do?
Resourced in what way? I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yeah, like how do you take care of your mental and spiritual health, I guess would be another way to put it. Take care of yourself.
Yes, that totally makes sense. Okay. So before I became a death doula, I worked and I still actually work there part-time, at a nonprofit where I was teaching a job training program to people who were unemployed or underemployed. Many were transitioning out of the prison system, were homeless, were in drug and alcohol recovery. So there was a lot of trauma that was coming along with my students. And I, as a baker, thought, oh, I'm going to teach baking. And then very quickly realized that I was going to have to learn how to be a social worker, and I was going to have to learn how to take care of myself better. It pretty much really was pointed out to me by my husband when I came home from work one day and said, we might be taking a 9-month-old baby. And he said, okay, but also I think maybe you should probably start going to therapy. And you used to really like meditating. Why don't you try that again? And I said, okay. And so I found a therapist and I found a meditation center in Philadelphia. I live right outside of Philly. And so I started going to their Monday night sanghas, which were like an open meditation. And we would sit and we would meditate as a group. And then we would read and we'd have discussions. And once I started going back to it on a regular basis, then I really started bringing it into my daily life. One of the things I did too is I stopped drinking. I didn't have a quote unquote drinking problem, but I would have a glass or two of wine at night, which led to me not getting up in the morning early enough to practice my meditation. And so now I have a regular practice that I've had for quite a few years where I get up before the family. I do, it's kind of yoga. I've been a yoga instructor for 20 something years, but the last few years I've started incorporating more fluid movements, almost more like dancing Tai Chi kind of movements into the practice. I do that every morning. It's just, I need it, right? It's like, it's part of my being needs it. And then I meditate, and I really need my daily practice. Plus, I do try to take the time to do other little rituals. Like at the end of the day, when I take a shower, I try to like really imagine just the water washing just everything off, like all the stuff. And when I am sitting with people, I have had people that I've talked to, especially when I'm volunteering at the hospital and I come, in contact when I'm there for the day, I'll come in contact sometimes with like 4 or 5 people that are either dying themselves or their loved ones dying, or they just found out that they can't continue treatment anymore. So they're dying soon, just maybe not right that second. And so after having some interactions that are maybe a little bit harder, I will cry, right? Like I won't cry there in front of them, but if I feel that it's like really weighing on me and it's really heavy, and I'll feel myself starting to tear up. And in the past, I was always one of those people, like I didn't cry. I would like push it all down and that's where it stayed. And now I'm like, no, if I need to cry to let it out, I will cry to let it out, to express it out of my body. Because I do believe, and if you practice Reiki, you understand this too, where it's just energy. And if I keep it in my body, it's going to cause problems. So I need to get it out, whether it's moving or crying or singing, screaming, right?
Dancing.
Whatever it is. Exactly. The things that really just kind of like vibrate it out of your body. But I do them regularly, even on days when I don't feel like I need it, right? I basically just need to do it every day. It's like, I've heard of people call it like spiritual hygiene. Like you brush your teeth every day.
Mm-hmm.
I need to do my practices every day because that's when I get the benefit. And I've tried explaining that to people when they'll say like, I tried meditating and it didn't work. I'm like, well, it's one of those things where you need to do it regularly. It's not going to do anything for you. And it's probably not even going to do what you think it's going to do, even if you meditate regularly.
Exactly.
But it's the practice of doing it that is the important part. That's when you see the benefits. Sitting down one time and trying to turn your thoughts off, which is what everybody thinks. Oh, I can't turn my thoughts off. I'm like, I've been meditating now for many years. I can't turn my thoughts off either. Like nobody really can.
That's right.
I get moments where it'll
Slivers.
be like, very silent. And then I'll be like, oh, I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind. There it goes. So yes.
So true.
I do have my practices.
That's amazing. I love it.
Perfect.
I love so many of them because I do the same, and I'm so pleased.
Oh, actually, one more that I want to tell you about briefly. That have you heard of the practice Tonglen? I feel like a lot of people that meditate have heard of it. And so, again, when I was working with students that were telling me, some of my students have been shot, they've been stabbed, they've had people right next to them get shot and killed. They have seen really tough things. And when they want to tell me about it, I want to hold the space to witness and to hear it. And I was finding that I would like start to eventually shut down. Like my body just couldn't handle it anymore. And so when I was at Shambhala one day and we were talking about Tonglen, and I kind of asked my teacher a little bit more about it, and I started actually using it when I was working with my students, in that when they were really telling me something that was just weighing on them and I didn't want to take it, like it's not mine, but I also want to be able to hold the space for them, I really started practicing Tonglen and just imagining myself like breathing it in, like just let me take it all in, but then I'm breathing out the love and the light and not holding it. And that practice has changed my life so much, because I'll do it even now. And it's not conscious now, I think, like where at first I had to actually stand there and listen to people and be like, breathe it in, Jill, and then breathe it out, breathe it in and breathe it out. Now I don't have to quite do that. I could just visualize it a little bit. And sometimes if I'm with somebody that's really, they've got a lot of fears around death and dying, or if they're dying and, they're completely nonverbal and I'm sitting with them, I'll practice Tonglen and I'll just imagine myself breathing in their fears and their anxiety and their pain and their shame and their guilt and all the icky stuff. I'm just going to take it for them, but then give them love back, because
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's been very
Yeah.
helpful.
I love that.
Beautiful. There's a wonderful version of that Joanna Macy wrote, that recorded, that we'll put it in the podcast notes just to give people an idea of what we're talking about. So beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah. So one of the last things we like to ask our guests is, what do you wish we had asked?
I don't think there's anything that I wish you would have asked. I mean, I think it's been a great conversation. I love that the conversations just kind of flow and go where they want to go sometimes. So I can't think of anything that I wish you would have asked that you didn't ask.
We did our job then.
You did your
We're good.
job. Yes, for sure.
Really, thank you. It's such an honor to work with you and to look at what you're doing online. And we look forward to working again with you in the future and hearing more. So we'll have the notes, podcast notes will link to all your work. And thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me on. I
Yes,
appreciate it.
thank you. You're so lovely.
So we have a poem that we found. Ana Luisa, you want to read it first, and then I'll read it after.
Sure. It's Clarity by Vivi Francis. Sorrow, oh sorrow, moves like a loose flock of blackbirds sweeping over the metal roofs, over the birches and the miles, one wave after another, then the sudden opening where the feathered swirl, illumined by dusk, parts to reveal the weeping heart of all things.
I can envision that. I've stood out in one of the areas near here and watched the flocks of crows who sweep back and forth in the morning and
Yes,
evening.
I have too.
So I can just envision that beauty. Thank you. I'll read it one more time. Sorrow, oh sorrow, moves like a loose flock of blackbirds, sweeping over the metal roofs, over the birches and the miles. One wave after another, then another, then the sudden opening, where the feathered swirl, illumined by dusk, parts to reveal the weeping heart of all things. Well, thank you again, and we look forward to continuing to work together to make this conversation something that more and more people can have. So thank you, Jill.
Thank you for having me today. It was definitely a pleasure, and I would love to do the podcast swap. So I'll have both of you on my podcast one day.
Yay! I'll see you soon then.
I look forward to that.
Yes.
Thanks so much for joining us on the End of Life Conversations. We appreciate you and look forward to sharing our stories. Thanks to my daughter Lucero and Nico Rush, who have cheerfully assisted us as our editors and tech support. Additional resources, transcript of this episode, and links to our social media will be in the podcast notes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And please subscribe, tell your friends, follow us on social media, and consider supporting us through Patreon. We want to acknowledge that the music we are using was composed and produced by Charles Heastand.